Hey everyone, thanks for your time. It's now September 2024. We're only 1 year away from the current target date for the Artemis II launch, and only 2 years away from the target date for the launch of Artemis III. There's been a lot more visible activities in the last several weeks, and we're seeing hardware for Artemis II, III, and IV move across the country or across the Atlantic. But there's still not enough information to tell if the progress that we're seeing are small steps or giant steps. In this video, I'll go over the Orion and SLS hardware deliveries to the Kennedy Space Center this past week. Then I'll go over more of my recent interview with Senior Exploration Ground Systems leadership, this time about plans and preparations for the Artemis II launch campaign, whenever the broader NASA leadership decides to proceed with that. And then I'll review some takeaways from the recent NASA Advisory Council meeting about the status for Artemis III and the lack of a future outlook for it. A lot of that activity has happened this summer, which I'm covering in these news videos. But the uncertainty about whether those two dates for Artemis II and Artemis III are more realistic or more aspirational remains prominent. We're waiting for more clarity about plans and schedules for 2025, and there could be a major decision about the path forward coming soon. But even the process and timing to make that decision about what to do with the Orion heat shield for Artemis II and the heat shield for all the spacecraft after that is unknown. Sometimes, like for the first half of this year, there's no activity reported and none seen. But now we're seeing another pattern repeat with highly visible delivery milestones on the one hand, but those milestones aren't necessarily critical path milestones, and the news isn't accompanied with any new information from NASA or their private Artemis partners about what comes next week, next month, or next year. Let's dig into the details of the current activity, but also what's missing about the outlook and forecast for the rest of 2024, 2025, and 2026. A hint is critical paths. The Canopy cargo ship carrying the European service module for Artemis III and the Pegasus barge carrying SLS hardware for Artemis II, III, and IV both arrived at Port Canaveral in Florida within several hours of each other. Canopy arrived first on the evening of September 2nd, and then tugs brought Pegasus into the port on the morning of the 3rd. ESM-3 was offloaded from Canopy on September 3rd and driven to the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building, where Orion prime contractor Lockheed Martin received it in the industrial operations zone of the building. Assembly, integration, and test of the ESM for Artemis III was completed by ESM prime contractor Airbus at its facility in Bremen, Germany. After ESM-3 arrived in the IOZ, it was uncrated, and we saw a few pictures of that. The module will be run through a post-shipment functional test to verify its systems integrity on arrival. Following that, the next step would be to mate the ESM with the crew module adapter to form the Artemis III Orion service module. As it was put by Mark Kurasich many years ago when he was NASA's Orion program manager, a long series of quote-unquote integrate and test cycles are in front of the Orion hardware and software to complete production. The CMA and ESM will first be bolted together in the lift station. The mated service module would then head to the clean room for a series of orbital tube welds to integrate fluid systems between the CMA and ESM. The next near-term milestone after that would be initial power-on of the service module to begin integrated testing and checkout. Pegasus was moved from Port Canaveral to the turn basin at KSC Launch Complex 39 a couple of days later on September 5th. A few images of the offload of the SLS Core Stage engine section hardware for Artemis III and IV are coming out, and there will be more to come, but we also got some pictures of what it looked like when it was packaged for shipment on the Building 103 floor of the Michoud Assembly Facility last month. NASA Public Affairs for the Marshall Space Flight Center and Michoud Assembly Facility published a set of still images taken of that hardware. These additional pictures provided a little bit of new information and context. We saw pictures of the boat tail for the Core Stage 3 engine section as it was lifted onto a shipping fixture on August 13th. In this view, as a lifting fixture is attached, we can see some of the main propulsion system fluid lines in the element. The boat tail includes hydraulic servicing ports and auxiliary power unit exhaust ports. These not only provide interesting details about the hardware, but they also show the boat tail for the Core Stage 4 engine section in assembly. This is basically how we saw the two boat tail assemblies in mid-July, with the Core Stage 3 unit waiting for this shipment next to the unit for Core Stage 4 being assembled. We were restricted from taking any imagery of that part of the factory at the time, so these pictures help illustrate current production activity. The engine section itself for Core Stage 4 was lifted onto another shipping fixture on August 23rd. By this time, the controlled work area inside the engine section had been broken down, and the floor assembly jig that the element was sitting in had been moved out of the way. The primary structure and probably most of the secondary structure inside is already complete, and because this shipment was delayed for upwards of half a year, some integration work was performed at MAF to continue production of the element, which has been the primary critical path for Core Stage builds so far. After being secured to the shipping fixture, the engine section was rolled into Building 110 at MAF, where it was fully packaged for delivery. PAO also released a 60-second video recap of rolling those two elements out to the barge on August 27th and 28th. Those two elements were offloaded first from Pegasus at KSC, beginning at daybreak on September 6th. Interestingly, the Core Stage 4 engine section was driven over to the vehicle assembly building and parked in the transfer aisle. The local KSC transporter then made the short return trip back to Pegasus, picked up the boat tail for the Core Stage 3 engine section, and then drove it out of the Launch Complex 39 area and down to the Space Systems Processing Facility in the KSC industrial area, where Boeing is working on integration of the engine section for the Artemis III stage. On Saturday, September 7th, the transporter picked up the launch vehicle stage adapter for Artemis II on its shipping fixture and drove it over to High Bay 4 of the vehicle assembly building. With the Core Stage 4 engine section now also in temporary storage in the VAB, it raises the question of how long it will stay there. Production of the element for Artemis IV cannot continue in the VAB, so it will be on hold until the unit is transported to the SSPF. NASA Public Affairs said the timing of that move was still to be determined, and that teams were looking at doing that in the coming weeks. The LVSA will be in storage in the VAB for a while, along with the Artemis II core stage already in the transfer aisle, until NASA decides when to start stacking SLS for the mission. That depends on a few things, most notably a decision about which options to go with for the Orion heat shield. No time frame for making or announcing that decision has been communicated, and it's not clear how long NASA leadership has to make that decision before running out of schedule margin for the current September 2025 launch date. However, the mobile launcher that SLS will be stacked on is still out at Pad 39B. That needs to be rolled back from the pad to the VAB, which is now expected no earlier than a couple of weeks from now. If that happens, then it will remain possible to begin stacking by the end of October. If not, and the ML remains out at 39B in October, then stacking will be no earlier than the middle of the fall. Whether or not a heat shield decision is made or announced soon, or whether stacking starts in October or later, it's not clear how much schedule margin is left for the Artemis II target date, which is only 1 year away now. There's more to go over in my interview with Cliff Lanham, the Senior Vehicle Operations Manager for Exploration Ground Systems. I spoke with him on Thursday, August 29th, about Artemis II preparations at the Kennedy Space Center. In the last video, I covered the current status of verification and validation testing and preparations to begin stacking the Artemis II SLS launch vehicle, possibly later this year. I also followed up on a few storylines that are likely to carry into the launch campaign, either based on the experience of the Artemis I launch campaign or based on lessons learned from that launch campaign. In addition to lessons learned, there are also the more obvious changes because Artemis launches going forward are planned to be crewed launches of Orion. Not only is the infrastructure being upgraded with elements like the emergency egress system, but there are also new aspects to the launch campaign and launch countdown because Artemis II adds the crew element going forward. But let's start with lessons learned from Artemis I, which could probably be bottom-lined as improvements to increase launch availability, which basically means increasing the number of launch attempts that can be made within a given period of time. For Artemis I and for the final two SLS Block 1 launches, Artemis II and Artemis III, the lunar launch periods repeat in an approximately 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off pattern. The flight termination system used for these first three SLS Block 1 launches has a maximum of 25 days that it can be used once it is activated. The system was baselined and envisioned to have a short 1 week long pad stay, but what Artemis I showed was that it took about a week and a half to prepare the vehicle for launch after it rolled out of the VAB to launch pad 39B. That 25-day clock begins when a final end-to-end test of the flight termination system is conducted between Exploration Ground Systems and the Eastern Test Range. And the final ordnance installations can't take place until after that test in the VAB. So combining those constraints with the frequency and duration of the lunar launch periods, you end up with a relatively narrow number of days to launch. To illustrate with what happened with Artemis I, for the first launch attempts, they ended up with only 3 opportunities at the end of that launch period. Due to issues with hydrogen instrumentation and leaks, they only made 2 attempts on August 29th and September 3rd before the launch period ended on September 6th of 2022. Based on the predefined constraints and rules, at that point NASA would have had to roll the vehicle back to the vehicle assembly building to reset the FTS. The next launch period was going to begin on September 19th, 2022, but it would have not been realistic to roll back, reset the FTS, roll out, and be ready to launch by the end of that next period on October 4th. NASA chose to stay at the pad and negotiate with the Eastern Range and the Space Launch Delta 45 to extend the 25-day clock. EGS and SLS teams worked to resolve the hydrogen leak situation and performed a tanking test. A one-time waiver was granted, and NASA reset to try again. But then a hurricane threat forced them to abandon that opportunity and roll back to the VAB. The waiver was a one-time thing, and for Artemis II, that 25-day clock remains the baseline. NASA and Space Launch Delta may work out new terms, but if that clock is still about the same length, NASA started looking at how they could reset the FTS at the pad. There are no permanent service structures at pad 39B, which reverted to the Saturn V clean pad concept of operations. Saturn had a mobile service structure that supported a multi-week stay at the pad, but EGS does not have that type of outdoor infrastructure, which requires higher maintenance costs, particularly for a system with a low flight rate. At the time that the delays of Artemis II and III were announced in January, Amit Kshatriya noted that they were looking into the capability to access the inside of parts of the SLS required to reset the FTS, and at that point that effort became something to follow up on. To summarize, this would be a set of access platforms that would be put into place at the pad that would allow personnel to enter the inner tank of the SLS Core Stage and the forward assemblies of the solid rocket boosters. They would need to set up internal work platforms inside and then do all the work to reset the FTS. That would include disconnecting ordnance, rerunning the end-to-end FTS tests with the range, which would reset the clock to 25 days, then reinstall ordnance, remove the internal platforms, and reinstall the flight doors. So this is what I asked Mr. Lanham about. Last time we talked, I'd asked about the status of establishing access to the inside of the boosters and the core stage inner tank out at the pad and working on that. What's the status of that right now?
So, you're talking about the contingency pad access system, if you will. So right now, what we've been focused on is the designs to do what we call all the hot work, welding interfaces onto the mobile launcher, so that there would have to be no welding in the VAB while we're stacking boosters. So we're nearing completion on that work here in the next couple of weeks, and then the design side, so that piece will be behind us. But then the actual design just hit basically a preliminary level recently, and they'll be looking to finish up the design by the end of the year, and then we'll get into building up the structure. So that's kind of where we are with the hardware. The teams are still looking at how the contingency access would be used in terms of if we had to use it at the pad, what are those timelines going to look like? So they're working through that. The idea here would be if we rolled out and we missed our primary launch attempt and our flight termination system were to expire, we could go reset that with this system. So that's where we are. That's what, kind of where we're headed.
Is there an expectation that there would be some kind of maybe an opportunity to do like a fit check of that one of the times that the vehicle's out of the pad before you go out for launch?
Yeah. So the idea would be we would work to do some of the testing on it, perhaps during a tanking test. Again, all those plans are being laid out to figure out what is the best options to go do that. Obviously, we want to minimize any risk to the vehicle in anything we do at that point. But that would be one option that we would look at.
I guess I'm kind of getting the sense from the being referred to as a contingency access,
yeah,
that in terms of the baseline plan, then when you get down to trying to align the vehicle readiness with a particular launch period, it sounds like you collectively are going to be in a similar situation as you were with Artemis I, where you have to that FTS end-to-end test and the ordnance installation will have to be lined up with the opening of whichever launch period is targeted. Is that still the case in that 25-day window? Is at least the approach is going to be the same going into the initial Artemis II launch attempts?
Yes. So we would look to do our FTS testing and ordnance again per the timelines. There is work to be done with the range in nailing down the requirement that we'll be working to, but with those numbers is how we set when we do the testing in the VAB in order to maximize our time on that as we get into the launch countdown.
So the current outlook for this contingency pad access capability is to finalize and make the necessary welds of interfaces to the mobile launcher structure this month while the ML is still out at the pad. The design of the access platforms will continue from a preliminary design to a final design and fabrication over the rest of this year and into next. And then we would look to see that out at the pad at some point when the mobile launcher returns next year. Orion and SLS have time limits on how long they are certified to stay outside at the pad, which is partially why earlier concepts of operations had a short pad stay. But Mr. Lanham said the week and a half at the pad from rollout to launch they arrived at with Artemis I was likely to be about the same with Artemis II. In terms of the pad flow for launch, at least the way it looks right now, it would be similar to the it'd be similar to the, well, would it be similar to the first one? I know now you're talking about an 8-hour setup time, so that sounds like that would fit into that kind of 10-day, 12-day pad flow when you're ready to roll out for launch.
Yeah, so we're still in that yes. In terms of the Artemis I versus Artemis II, rollout for launch, timelines are very similar. Obviously, we're a little smarter on from Artemis I to where we can refine those timelines even more. But you're generally in that same ballpark of time that we used on Artemis I.
For launch, the work at the pad is streamlined. Once the mobile launcher is hard down on the pedestals it rests on at pad 39B, all the connections from the pad to the ML, like fluids and electrical, are made and validated. In parallel, the emergency egress system setups would be performed, running the lines from the ML to the pad terminus area and setting up the baskets on them. Loading hydrazine on the solid rocket booster's hydraulic power units is a hazardous operation, and the immediate pad area would be cleared for that. Once that is complete, then final countdown preparations could begin, such as positioning the mobile flame deflectors and extra structural supports around the pad flame trench. The countdown is about 48 hours long. So there's a lot that Integrated Operations has in work for the launch campaign, and in parallel, the launch team is working on changes to the countdown timelines for this first launch of Orion and SLS with a crew on board. This will be the third test flight of Orion and the second for SLS. Near the end of the pre-launch preparations, after Orion is connected to SLS and the vehicle is fully stacked, the crew will participate in additional launch day rehearsals. This is the first time for EGS, Orion, and SLS with astronauts on board, so the crew has already taken part in a first dress rehearsal to work on refining and iterating on the launch day timeline. SpaceX has dominated U.S. crew launch for the past 4 years, where the crew boards Dragon for the taxi ride to ISS before Falcon 9 is loaded with propellant. But the Orion SLS vehicle follows the heritage of other crewed vehicles where they board after propellant loading is completed. For the first time with Artemis II, the launch team will be balancing the relatively long 2-hour launch window on launch day with a time constraint on how long the crew can lie on their backs in Orion before launch, which is 5 hours and 15 minutes from when the first crew member boards Orion. It takes some amount of time for the drive from crew quarters in the operations and checkout building out to pad 39B. Final boarding in the white room before the 4 astronauts get in, and then some standard checks of communications and the pressure integrity of the crew cabin. A preliminary look at the plan early last year had a launch day countdown demonstration rehearsal taking place with the crew getting in Orion while the vehicle and mobile launcher were still in the VAB. But it's been a long time since we asked, and things change, so I asked Mr. Lanham what he's heard, since he'd already noted this was more of a responsibility for the launch team, led by Artemis launch director Charlie Blackwell Thompson. I think they'd mentioned this was last year that there was going to be a sort of a countdown demonstration test or something along those lines with the crew in the VAB, since it wouldn't be a wet test anyway. But obviously it's been several months since I spoke with them, and I know plans evolve over time. Are there any plans to do a countdown test with the crew out at the pad? Has that been moved from the VAB to the pad, or maybe you're going to do one of each now, or what do you know about that?
So we are looking to the test will most likely be split up into a pad portion and a VAB portion. So I do think that's the direction we're headed in. And as we get closer, obviously, we can adjust our planning accordingly. But right now, we're looking at a portion of it possibly being at the pad. I think the launch team would like to do that. So, and obviously, like you said, right, a lot of factors go into these tests and the timing of these tests. So, but yeah, there's certainly a portion in the VAB and most likely a portion at the pad.
Speaking of Artemis III, there were a few takeaways about that mission from the NASA Advisory Council meeting on August 29th. Leadership for NASA's Exploration Directorate reported in public to the Human Exploration and Operations Committee. They provided a high-level summary of Artemis status across the different programs for the upcoming missions. The first takeaway about Artemis III was that the short-term Starship flight test schedule remains cloudy. NASA officials said that the next Starship flight test would be in the fall, which would mean that the no earlier than launch date is closer to the end of September than now. It's been 3 months since the fourth flight test on June 3rd, and 1 month since SpaceX said the flight hardware was ready to fly. SpaceX is working on recovering the Super Heavy booster and another intact re-entry and water landing of the Starship during an orbital velocity flight. Flight Test 5 was said to be fall or later in the fall, which could be anywhere from late September to late December. There was also an interesting, at least to me, note that Catherine Kerner made in the meeting about Starship HLS.
SpaceX will fly at least one uncrewed demo mission to land the Starship on the lunar surface before it will be ready for its Artemis mission.
I don't recall hearing the at least part before. It's possible that multiple test flights are part of the rapid design iteration for Starship, but it had not been stressed until now. So I'm asking if this was just elaborating on existing strategy or if it's a change, and I'll report back when we get a response from NASA. As noted at the top, we're now only 2 years away from the Artemis III target launch date, and the calendar does not stop or slow down. One of the big picture takeaways from the public update was that there was nothing about the medium or long-term horizon for any of the programs supporting Artemis III. For Orion and SLS, there wasn't much information to help put these visible milestones into the context of a master schedule. For Starship, it remains unclear how many flight tests need to launch before an orbital attempt will be made, or how many more flight tests need to launch before the ship-to-ship propellant transfer demo begins. For Axiom, the milestones noted go back to the spring, so progress since then is not known. So it remains difficult to tell whether the schedule is getting better, staying the same, or getting worse. One of the main missing pieces is up-to-date information on the critical path. We have heard that Starship HLS is the critical path for Artemis III overall, but there isn't much information about what the critical paths are for the different elements. For example, what is the critical path individually for Starship HLS to be ready? What is the critical path for SLS, for Orion, and for Axiom? And what are the current dates for those milestones? The last information provided about that was published in March and was probably composed closer to the beginning of the year. So that information is well out of date at this point. The Artemis III schedule is dependent on when Artemis II launches, and NASA has big decisions to make about that, but it is also directly dependent on development and assembly of Artemis III flight hardware, and that is going on independently of Artemis II preparations. So even with some of these visible milestones, most of the questions about the outlook for the rest of this year and the next 2 years still remain unanswered. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. We're still waiting to see whether NASA decides to press ahead with final preparations for the September 2025 target date for Artemis II. But in the meantime, the mission has been planned since the last decade, and now that we're inside of 1 year to the current date, I have an upcoming video on some of the history of the mission and an early preview.